Hola, so daddy, nghe nghe là chuyện đến này đã.
We will begin with the opening prayers. Please recite the opening prayers.
So đã thì năm nay cái sinh rồi. Đó là số. Còn gì rồi nó chân chân đã đi cái này nhưng mà sao này về nó cái gì đó cái này về cái rồi đó cái rồi bây giờ cái này vào đó 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 cái đó mấy chuyện gì này thì 어떤 면면지 아무도 이제 저는 저기 저러 나 상이 저러도 이제 대회 유연바 아니야 다음에 지내지는 이제 가나 주제도 이제 디지놈을 잡아가 하서도 이제 저기 잡은 이제 냠으로도 되는데 이제 나에게 나는 이게 루모나도 매게라도 그 일하게 돼서 봐 삼재게도 나게 쉐도 음 암다저 세계에서 이제 이제 밤에 링크 배제 실험인데 나는 저기서 도저된 건 줄아서 네, 시작을 하기로 영어 연습에 얻은 뒤지나 봐. 여행대 먹으면서 봐. 그 이유는 무엇이라서 한다. 인도 좀 뭐이나 말로 로드 좀 주는 이제 로드 좀 주지 않대. 로드 좀 주는 소한테 너도 좀 그렇으니 이제 같이 좀 많이 해봐. 주로 좀 주로 이게 저 로드 좀 주는 소한테 뒤버 좀 버리죠. 그래서 자기 좀 똑똑한도 요즘에 좀 가더냐. 니금 좀 배셔라서 안돼. 반대로 저하를 건조 아마 가마 봐. 경으로 근주는 쓰시베 이런 좀 틀려고 이제 저번에 주시면 인정들 내주도 저기 변도 라면도 지 경어란지 반대서 아마를 보셔야 다 그저 울면 되죠라. 그런 신경 꺼내지. 구성도 영어로 자도서 아서 다 통화들이야. 되니 야시你们国的你们的呀
Today, on this 9th day of our summer teaching, I would like to wish all the monks and nuns from our various monasteries and nunneries, the Dharma centers, all my Dharma friends from the east and west of this world, and of all of our friends and relations, primarily in the land of Tibet. I would like to wish you all my warm greetings. Now, this was a text that I was supposed to give yesterday, and supposed to have a day off tomorrow. But the text for yesterday, so it took some time to actually prepare it well. It was very complicated. Also, as I mentioned the other day, I've been thinking I would like to begin the topic of Buddhism fairly soon, and there are many reasons. The first is that many of you, or is that there is many of people are hoping that I will speak about this, and they're encouraging me to speak about this. And I have thought that I should get into that topic as soon as I can. And so for this reason, I was unable to teach yesterday. And so I'd like to beg your pardon for that. So today, as I have explained the other day, the traditions of the 6 branches of the Vedas all arose from the tradition of the Vedas themselves and the Brahmanas and the Upanishads. Now, the Upanishads, on the other hand, arose primarily from the Upanishads, and so I'd like to introduce them briefly. Now, during the age of philosophy, what happened is at first there were the sutras, and these developed out of the Brahmanas. And then there were the 6 darshanas, or Orthodox Hindu schools, which developed out of the Upanishads. Now, in general, there are many different views that developed in that era. And the main reason for there to be so many different philosophies or views is because the Upanishads, the views presented in the Upanishads, are primarily just records of the ideas that occurred to people, and they appeared in different fragments. They aren't completely logical. They aren't complete logical texts. And so for that reason, within the 6 darshanas, the 6 Orthodox Hindu schools, once the Samkhya school appeared, then only then did a deep and assiduous school of logic developed. And so it was only after the Samkhya developed that this occurred. Now, what are these philosophies investigating? They're investigating the research between the mind and matter, the nature of the world, what is going to happen to us in the future, what sort of plans are best for us to investigate for the future. So these are the subtopics that they investigated in detail. So basically, the first philosophy that had a complete philosophy with all the different aspects was the Samkhya. And because it was first, then all the later schools also had showed a great influence of the Samkhya school. And so if we begin with the Samkhya, then the last of these six Darshanas or Orthodox Hindu schools is the Vedanta. And so because there are other schools that appeared primarily to investigate the meaning and also the Vedanta also appeared in order to sort of compete with the Samkhya school and then spread widely. And so this is a school that we take great interest in. Now, there's been a lot of interest and research into this school. And in particular, the Advaita or non-dual Vedanta school that has the position that the Brahma and the self are not true. And so for that reason, many people have praised this Advaita Vedanta tradition, the non-dual Vedanta tradition. And so because of the development of these six darshanas, the Orthodox Hindu schools, there's a very complete set of philosophical schools that appeared in India. And so these six schools that developed reached a very high level in terms of the world philosophy and spread widely throughout the world. Not only these six Orthodox Hindu schools, but there are many other schools that also appeared. For example, there's a sutra that is translated into Chinese. It's called the Sutra of the Chatara Woman, and it's very famous in China. Now, it's not all that well known in Tibetan. However, it does speak about the 62 different philosophical views. Likewise, within the original text of the Buddha, in the Tripitaka, in one scripture, it says that there are 96 different views. Now, the views at that time were generally considered inferior views, and so only a few of them have been preserved continuously to the present day. Now, the ones that have been preserved, whom we have the texts for, are for the ones that are contained within these six Orthodox Hindu schools. And among them, the one that is kind of like the most remarkable, and that is the original of philosophy, is the Sankhya school. And so the Sankhya school, for that reason, is very special. Now, the root texts of these six Orthodox schools are primarily written in the sutra style. They're written as sutras. And so the words of the sutras are therefore very easy. They're written in verse and they're not too long. And so for that reason, if you don't have a commentary, then if you just read the root text, it's actually difficult to get understanding. Now, the reason why the root text of the six Orthodox schools is in the form of a sutra is so that it would be easier for students to memorize and easier for them to keep in mind. That is probably why they're written in the style of sutras. And since they're in a very aphoristic style in verse, so they're easy to memorize. If they're written in prose, they would be long sentences that would be hard to memorize. In any case, around the 6th century BC, there was actually a great revolution in thinking philosophy all around the world. There was and also the Persian master Zoroaster, and also Confucius in China, and also the Indian sage Kapila, the founder of the Sankhya school. And likewise, the Buddha, they all appeared in the same era, probably within the space of 1 or 2 centuries. And so they all appeared, one after another within this period. So that was a time, that time of the 6th and the 5th century BC was a place where there's a great development and great change in philosophy and thought. So generally, when you think about the philosophy in the world, there are many different philosophies that have come and many different views. But though there are many different philosophies, but fundamentally, the basic questions that they are investigating are actually fundamentally the same. And if we were to think about the basic teachings of philosophies in terms of the 6 questions, like the first of the questions would be like, who am I? Where did I come from? Where will I go? So people wonder, who am I? Where did I come from? And so you have this feeling, it's like we have this feeling that there's a me. And we think, well, where did I come from? What is the origin that I came from? Where am I going to go in the future? What is going to happen to me? So these sorts of doubts occur to us. So that's one question. So basically, when we think about philosophies, only if you have doubts or questions can you have a philosophy. If you don't have any doubts or questions, then there's no way you can have a philosophy. Now, the second question is, what is the relation between mind and matter? What is the relation between external things and the internal mind? And there are the things that we can see. And there's also the mind that we can't see, but we can feel. So there are these two. And are there any phenomena that transcend these two? Now, the third question is, it's not just us, but how did this external world come into being? When we look with our eyes, they're the things that we see. We don't think anything else, but we wonder, what is this larger universe that is greater than what we can see? And was there in the beginning a creator who made this vast world of ours? And the world changes too, right? Like the sun rises, the sun sets. There are the changes of the 4 seasons. And so who made these changes occur? So that's another section. Now, the fourth question is, now, in case there is actually a creator of this world, what is that creator like? If it's a god or a human, what is this being like? What is its character like? And the reason for this is, when we look at this world, we see a lot of inequalities. Some people are rich, some people are poor. Some people from the moment they're born in good situations, and some people from the moment they're born in bad situations. There are many such situations in the world. So why is it that not everyone has a good situation? Why are some people in bad situations? This is another way of thinking. So when we think about a creator of the world, then we have the question, is the creator of the world compassionate or not? And also, does the questioner have like a form? Is it like a human form, or is it someone with, or is it not? It's an inapparent form, kind of like it's like a god with no actual form. So it's a God with a more inapparent form. Now, the next question is, where does wrong and misdeeds come from? So this is the question of good and bad, or virtue and misdeeds. So where do misdeeds come from? What's the origin of wrongs? And likewise, how can we reach a stage of perpetual happiness? Is there a place where we can go where we'll experience eternal happiness, or is it a level of thinking, or so forth? And so there are many such questions that come up. So if we kind of summarize the questions of philosophy, I think that basically is what they come to. And so I've explained these in order to make it easy for you to understand. Actually, maybe it's better to say this first. Now, generally, when we're thinking about the history of Indian philosophy, but speaking about world philosophy, so now I'm thinking about the Indian philosophy, what they call all those philosophers that respect the Vedic literature as sacred. They're called the Astika schools, or they say that these are the they call the Astika, or the schools that present of existence. And so they call all these schools that respect the Vedic literature as positive, or they can be called orthodox schools. Now, those schools that do not accept the Vedas as sacred are called the Nastika. And so this is actually considered like a nihilistic view, a wrong view, a bad view. Now, when you think about the existential view, these are considered the better Hindu schools. And among them, there are 6. These are called the 6 orthodox schools. And these are considered the schools about being. And so these are called the 6 darshanas, or the 6 orthodox schools. So there are the traditions of the 6 orthodox schools, and there are the unorthodox schools. And so what is the dividing line between these two? Now, of course, there are many ways to answer this question, but at that time, they used, if we take the Vedic literature they used at that time and used that as the basis for our investigation, I think that is the most appropriate. And the reason for this is this. There is an Indian master called Madhava Acharya. So this is called Madhava Acharya, and he was probably a 14th century master. And he wrote a text called A Summary of All Views, or Asavadarshana Sangraha. And within this, he speaks about the philosophies of 16 different schools in great detail. And then explaining the philosophies of the 16 schools. Now, the author himself is a Vedantist, a member of the Vedanta school. So he described how the schools discussed things, what their attention. He explains them. And he speaks about the distance between those schools and the Orthodox Vedanta school. And so he takes that as, so I'm going to present the order using that presentation as the basis, using his school as the basis. Now, to give the order, I've got this list here. And the beginning, the first one is the Lokayata school. This is the first one. Is the ones that are higher on the list are those that are more distant from the Vedas, and those that are on the bottom are closer to the Vedas. Now, the school that is furthest from the Vedanta is the Lokayata school. So the Lokayata school is the most different from the Veda school. Now, the second is the Buddhist school. And then after that, there's the Jainism, and then each of them in order. And then the last one I've listed is yoga. Now here I have not listed the Vedanta, and the reason is because the author who is making the order is himself a Vedanta, and so he didn't put the Vedanta in his list. And so if we think about what the closest to the actual view is the yoga, and then after that, the Sankhya school. So that the time the Vedantas, the way they saw the other Indian schools, and the way they considered the distance or the harmony between their view and the other schools, it can be understood by looking at this list. Now, at the time when these philosophies were developing, was like a new age or great revolution in individual Indian philosophy. From one perspective, this is a time when people are newly compiling the old or recompiling the old rituals. They were establishing laws. And they invented new and more complete grammar and poetics. In particular, as I mentioned the other day, they had invested greatly the ideas of geometry, and they really reached the heart of geometry. And so there was also great advancement in mathematics. And so in particular, in philosophical thing, there were great developments, so that many different schools and philosophical schools developed. And as these developed, then eventually, then even the Buddhist teacher was able to arise and continue, because it was in such of an environment. And the Buddhist philosophy was able to really distinguish itself and reach a very high level of view. It was in such an environment where it was able to and could reach such a high level. If it had not been in such an environment, then it would have been difficult for Buddhism to develop in India. So to become such a remarkable and such an eminent philosophy, it was because of because there are so many philosophies, which we would consider non-Buddhist or Hindu philosophies, and there was because of the great development in thinking. And so because of this, that Buddhism was able to develop and improve and advance so far. It's because it arose and developed in this environment of India. So if we think about these reasons, we should be grateful to the Orthodox Hindu schools and consider them to be very important. Similarly, when we think about these philosophical texts are really a great accomplishment that the ancient Indian masters have left behind for our entire world. So, in particular, the Samkhya school that was founded by the sage Kapila is like the ancestor school of all Indian philosophy. So it's an extremely important school. Likewise, the Buddhist teachings that were established by our teacher, the Buddha Shakyamuni, because they're sort of advanced and developed and advanced so far, and became quite independent. And so there are a lot of changes that occurred and they've developed gratefully. And so these two philosophies are like exemplars of the great advances and developments that of Indian philosophy of that period. Now I would like to give an introduction to each of these 6 Orthodox schools. Now, if I were to, as I go through and give an introduction to each of these schools, if I were to go into detail, then there's a lot to say. It would take 2 or 3 days to explain each of them. But since our primary topic is not the non-Buddhist schools, so primarily I'll just give a little bit of historical background, and that'll be the primary focus of my introduction. And I do not plan to speak too much about the actual philosophy. Now, in the future, if I have the opportunity, I think it's possible that I will have an opportunity to give a more in-depth presentation of them. For example, if in teaching to the Shedders, if I have the opportunity, I will be able to do some research and give a teaching in more detail on them. So if this opportunity arises, I would like to do this. So today, what I'd like to do is to give just a brief historical background of these schools. So among the first of the 6 Orthodox schools is the Samkhya school. Now, among all of the philosophical traditions of India, the Samkhya are recognized as being the oldest. Not only that, within the entire world, it's the Samkhya is like the earliest philosophical tradition of the world. I think so. It is permissible to say this. Now, the word Samkhya appears in the Upanishads. Even before the Samkhya school developed, this word was used. Now, of course, there are many different ways to explain the name, but the original meaning of the word is counting. So among all the academics who research the Samkhya school, one of the most important and influential is a German scholar named Garbe. What he explains is that the reason why the school is known as the Sankhya, or the counting school, is that all phenomena are included within a count of 2 original constituents that they're made up of. And likewise, all the natures of everything are included within 20. And so because everything is called counting, everything is counted within this. So all the other schools started to ridicule them as counting. Oh, they're just counting things, and called them the counters. And so for that reason, they were given the name Samkhya school. And so this is what this scholar says. Now, so who is the founder of the Sankhya school? This founder of the Sutra school is generally accepted to be the sage Kapila. Now, the reason why he's called Kapila is this is because he's Kapila means light yellow. And so his body was light yellow in color. So he's called Kapila, or light yellow. Now, he had a student named Asuri. And Asuris had a student named Panchashika. And so these are there are many different students and teachers, but these are among the best. But the question of, it's difficult now to say how important they actually were and what impact they had on the Samkhya tradition is difficult to say because they didn't leave any traces behind. But in particular, later people would have as much faith and reverence as for the sage Kapila as they would for a god. Now, that sort of reverence did not occur for the founders of the other schools, and so, but it did happen for Kapila that he was revered as a god and as a great being. Now, the main reason why people developed such a love and affection for Kapila is that, in a historical reason, it had been a very long time. He was very ancient, and a long time had passed since he founded the system. And so, for that reason, he was considered very important. For example, the Buddha, the sage Kapila, was also very well known, even a century before our teacher, the Buddha, appeared. So, for one perspective, he was a great thinker, a logician. He was the founder of a tradition. And he's among the oldest founders of a tradition, and so that's one reason why. But he probably didn't have that many students who actually upheld his tradition. And so for that reason, his position, his philosophical school remained philosophy, but it really didn't become an actual religion. Sometimes we talk about the difference between religions and philosophies. But for one thing, we think there's not much of a difference between a religion and a philosophy, but there is a difference. For example, like within our Buddhist tradition, especially in the Tibetan tradition, we talk about the four different philosophical schools. For example, we think about like the Madhyamaka school, the middle way school. We think about them as a philosophical school or as a philosophical school, but not as a religion. But the non-Buddhist schools did not really rise to the status of like being a religion, not like Buddhism, which became like Buddhism. Actually, the Sankhya school was a very ancient philosophy and a very influential school, but it was not able to turn into a religion in its nature. Now, the second thing I'd like to speak about is the fundamental texts of the Sankhya school. Now, the six orthodox schools had texts that they considered the most important, the fundamental schools. Now, all of these were written in the style of a sutra, in verse. So they're written as sutras, but for the Samkhya school, there is a Samkhya sutra, but there is a lot of debate about whether the Samkhya verses can be identified as like a root text. And the reason I'll talk about later. So now within the Samkhya school, the text they consider the most important is called the verses on the Samkhya, or in Sanskrit, the Sankhya Karika. So the Sankhya Karika, this text was written by Ishvara Krishna. So his name is Ishvara Krishna. So it's written by Ishvara Krishna, probably in the 5th or the 4th century BC, it is considered. Now, the Samkhya sutras traditionally they're said to have been written by the founder, the sage Kapila, and this is often said. But people who research this actually have a debate about whether these Samkhya sutras are written by Kapila or not. Now, the reason why there is because there is no discussion of this text in the early Samkhya text. They don't mention the Samkhya Sutra, and they do not quote from it either. And so if the Sankhya Sutra was written by Kapila and was so apparent, then they would have to discuss it and quote from it, but they don't even discuss it. Now, the second reason is that within the Samkhya Sutra, there are many traces of the Vedanta on it. There's a great influence of the Vedanta, and there are many signs of the Vedanta within it. And so, for that reason, they assert that it was written by by a scholar of the Vedanta school, somewhere maybe in the 9th century or perhaps in the 14th century. This is what the scholars say. Now, above, I mentioned the name of the scholar named Garbe. And he says that the earliest time that the Samkhya Sutras could have been written was probably in the 14th century, probably no earlier than 1380. And the latest date is around 1415 AD. And so he identifies this as the period when the Samkhya Sutras were written. And so for this reason, researchers doubt that the Sankhya Sutras are written by Kapila. So now, in place of that, the most important Samkhya text is the verses on the Samkhya Karika. Now, there are 7 well-known commentaries on the verses on Samkhya in India, but I don't have time to recite the names of it, so I won't speak about them now. In Chinese, though, there's a text called the 70 Golden Verses, which is also a Samkhya text that was translated into Chinese. It was translated by Yangda Tempa. It's called Master Wensi in so he was actually a Korean monk. His homeland was Korea, and in that time, it's during the Tang Dynasty. And so this Master Wensi wrote a long commentary on the Sutra of Unraveling the Thought. And then he speaks about this verse over and over again. And so he's often written about. So in this 7th century, he translated the 70 Golden Verses into Chinese. Now, there's a story about why it's called the 70 Golden Verses, but I don't need to tell that now. Now, there is debate as to whether these 70 Golden Verses are the same as the Samkhya verses written by Ishvara Krishna. So that is speaking about now, I don't need to speak about that in detail. I've spoken about the texts. Now I'd like to speak about the tenets, not in detail though. Now, basically, the Samkhya is fundamentally a dualist system, saying that all noble phenomena come from 2 basic constituents. And what those 2 basic constituents, the first of them is the person or the Purusha. This is what we call the person or the Purusha. And so it's also called the self. And it's in cognition by nature. It is the knower, it's the consumer. Another name of it is, the name of the other constituent is called the primal nature or pradhana. So it's called primal nature or the fundamental nature. Now that is material by nature. To explain it very simply, what it's saying is you've got one cognitive constituent, and then so among the constituents you have one's a cognitive constituent, one is a material constituent. So that's basically what it is. Now, this has the 3 qualities and the 20 manifestations and so forth. So instead, this is a time when I'm not speaking about the tenets of the philosophical schools. There's a lot of, now I've done a lot of research into this until I got a headache from it. There's a lot to say, but I think it's better not to speak much about it today. If I speak in brief, then you won't understand. And if I say too much, there's not enough time. And so it's difficult. And so for that reason, and there's no need to speak about that, but basically, it's a dualistic tradition with two basic constituents. You've got there's the self, which is the Purusha, which is primarily not knowing, and then you've got the primal nature, is basically and basically material. Now, all phenomena are said to arise from the primal nature. And so, unless I went into great detail on this, it'd be very difficult for you to understand. Now, the second philosophical school is the yoga school. Now, the yoga school is positioned. The Sankhya school is actually an atheist school. They don't. They say that there is no creator of the world. They say to say there's a completely no deity. There's no logic to prove that there's no creator, and you can't prove validly that there's any creator of the world. And so that's the view that they have. And because it has that basic view, so many of that time did not really support the Samkhya system. The reason for this is that most people thought that there was a good, thought that God was important and sacred. And so, because they thought this way, they didn't support the Sankhya position. And so in order to rectify this fault, then the yoga philosophy arose. Now, this yoga school, if we think about it from another perspective, the yoga school upholds the tenets and accepts the tenets of the Samkhya school, but then they, in addition to that, they also hold that there is a supreme deity, Ishvara, that they worship and have devotion for. And then they also had some particular aspects of the secret practice of yoga, perception. So basically, the yoga school, in terms of the philosophy, takes the Samkhya school as the basis and then adds some practices of yoga to that. And so for that reason, it's not a philosophy that brings out something special and separate from the Sankhyas. In actuality, the yoga schools are what you could say the theistic Samkhyas. You could say that they're the atheistic and the theistic religions, right? To talk about the theistic Samkhyas, that would be the yoga school. So generally, to talk about the meaning of the word yoga, the word itself appears in some Aryanas and some Upanishads, and so for that reason, we can say that the practice of yoga had already existed prior to this, and it developed gradually. Likewise, it speaks in the Mahabharata as if the yoga school were present in its time, or that the Mahabharata was after the tradition had developed. But when researching this, that a yoga tradition that has a character of a philosophy, that it was had a fully developed text, was after the writing of the sage Patanjali. So he was founded by this sage Patanjali, and the reason why he wrote this is that he wrote a text called the Yoga Sutras. And after he wrote this, only then did a yoga school with a complete philosophical tradition arise. Now, the dates for Patanjali's birth and death, we can't say. This is the biggest problem in Indian history. The biggest question is that when you speak about the great beings, the beings who are great scholars and accomplished masters, and you say, when did they were born, when did they pass away? You can't say them all. There's no dates for any of them. Now, when researchers look into this matter, the way they research is that in the 4th century before BC, before the Common Era, there is the sage Panini, whom we mentioned the other day, who wrote the great text on grammar called the Panipa, the Panipa grammar. Now, there's a commentary on the grammar by Pani called the Mahadyasam. And this commentary was written by the sage Patanjali. So if we look at that commentary, we can see that Patanjali was probably an author from the 1st century of the Common Era. But there are people who doubt whether it actually was Patanjali who wrote the commentary on the Panini's grammar. And there are other people who say that Yoga Sutras are actually not written by a single author. But instead, there are many fragments of Yoga Sutras that were compiled over a long period of time, of many years, by many different yogis. And that it was around the time of Nagarjuna in the 2nd or the 3rd century of the Common Era that the actual text was completed. Now, there are some other scholars who say that the Yoga Sutras and their author probably appeared in the 5th or 6th century BC. So there are many different positions on this because there's no clear history of this. So when you are doing research into the history, it's not clear. So the scholars come up with many different hypotheses. Now, generally, when you think about the Yoga Sutras, it has 4 chapters. There are 4 basic chapters to the Yoga Sutras. And so there are 4 chapters. And the first chapter is called the Samadhi Pada, the chapter on Samadhi. The second is called the Sadhana Pada, the chapter on practice. The third is Vibhuti Pada, the chapter on power. And the fourth is Kaivalya Pada, or the chapter on isolation. So isolation here means liberation. The Samkhya is called liberation, isolation. So it's basically when you have the Purusha, the self, remaining alone. When the self is separated from the primal nature and exists on its own, this is called isolation or liberation. So that is why it's called this. So it has the 4 chapters. So now what it teaches in the Samadhi Pada, the chapter on Samadhi, it teaches about Samadhi. It's the practice of Samadhi. Now what we mean by Samadhi is like when you limit the movement of the mind. Limit the movement of the mind from the focus. And it's like the level of the mind where you attain that. So in order to limit the motion of the mind, you have to train constantly in this. You have to instill the habits into this. You have to instill the habits of mindfulness and awareness. It does not happen all at once. In addition to that, you have to have faith and devotion for Ishvara. And through this, the superior experiences of yoga arises. So that's basically what's taught in the chapter on Samadhi. Then there's the Sadhana Pada, the chapter on practice. And so there are various methods for developing the superior practice of yoga. There's many different ways to do it. They teach that there are 8 different methods, and among the basic ways that are the last 3, which are called dharana, jhana, and samadhi. These are like the essence of the practice of yoga. If we achieve samadhi, then what happens is that we develop miraculous powers and clairvoyant powers. And we are freed from the bonds of birth and death and achieve the state of liberation. So this is what it teaches. The next chapter is the chapter on yoga and vibhuti, which teaches on clairvoyance. If you met clairvoyance, and so if you meditate on samadhi, what happens is you develop clairvoyance. And so it speaks about knowing the past and future events, hearing sounds in all directions, knowing about situations in other worlds, being able to have conversations with gods and spirits, being able to fly in the air, to walk on the water without sinking, and gaining many other superhuman powers. And so I don't need to speak about them in detail, but basically the yogas, so there are many differences. So in terms of the practice and the practice of yoga, there are many differences from the Samkhya, but in terms of philosophy, it's essentially the same. Now, during the time when yoga was developing, it was actually very close to the assertions of the Samkhya. And it basically accepts the basic presentation of the 25 nobles without any alteration. But the Samkhya vows are basically saying that there is no atheist, or they say that there is no valid reason to say that there is no creator of the world. But instead of that, the yoga school asserts that there is the god Ishvara, or Maheshvara, the great Ishvara. And so because they assert that there is a god, the Samkhyas are called the godless Samkhya, or the atheist Samkhya, and the yoga school are called the theistic Samkhya. So these within this Tibetan text on the philosophical schools, they speak about the theistic and the atheistic Samkhya schools, but they don't speak about the yoga school. They don't use the term the yoga school. And the reason is because of the similarities in their philosophical views. But now one big difference is that the yoga school asserts that there is a god and a permanent Ishvara who is other than the Purusha and the primal nature. They assert that there is this. Now, the relation between Ishvara and the self is that so the god is like the universal of all Purushas, and the Purusha is like the individual stuff, but there's no time to go into great detail, so I will not speak much about it. So in brief, the yoga school's feature is that it takes the Samkhya tenets and with the presentation of a god and unites these two. And this becomes like a distinctive quality of the texts on the yoga school. And so for that reason, this was very appealing to Indo-Aryan people. And so it had a very full presentation on logic, and it had this the Sankhya schools of thorough logical analysis. In addition, they had the presentation of God, and so for a short period of time, people were very smitten with it, and they thought it was great, and they followed the yoga school. But what's disappointing is that at that time in the society, there became more like a superstitious or blind views. And it's like the Tantra, the people began to they developed a great interest in the mantras, such as were taught in the Atharva Veda, as I mentioned before. And so the practice of mantras. Now, I'm speaking the practice of mantra here. It's different from our practice of mantra. When they're practicing the practice of mantra at that time was primarily was because of their interest in accomplishing things for this lifetime, not for future lifetimes. They took a great interest in the practice of mantra, and so. This is so. At the beginning, the mantra school was not very important, but in the end, they're fooled by the teachings on mantra, and they began to make giving sacrifices, and it made animal sacrifices and very cruel sacrifices. And because they had so many sacrifices, the Nadra school lost its high regard in the status, and it decreased in status till in the end. So at the beginning, the yoga school really spread very widely. In the end, it declined very rapidly. And so for that reason, it did not spread very widely and could not maintain its status for a long period of time. So now we will take a 30-minute break.
Jide